Well, I do hope that you all are enjoying a great day. I'm pretty sure it's Monday. I sometimes lose track, but thank you and welcome and thank you for joining us today. Of course, I'm Jeffrey Daugherty, the Christian Whistleblower. Thank you for being here at the channel. And if you've been here for a while, you'll recognize my guest today. He's probably my favorite guest, great guy, a scholar, former entrepreneur, world traveler, and author of two of the most amazing books. One I have read, one I'm reading. And of course, we're talking about Caesar's Messiah, this book right here, which basically posits, and I think proves beyond a shadow of any objective doubt, that Jesus was created by the Romans and the Gospels were written by the Romans for a couple of reasons. We'll talk about those. Number one, to calm down Jewish messianism. And number two, to get the Jews and their posterity to worship the Roman Caesars without even knowing it. And as a final twist, it was meant to be figured out someday. And maybe that day is today. And with that, I'd like to welcome my friend and great author and scholar, Joseph Atwill.
Hey, Jeff, how are you? Thanks for having me on.
I am great. It's always my honor and privilege to have you. You know that. And you just had a great trip. I'm glad you had a good time and got rested up.
Indeed. Yeah, always good to be home, though. So, when you travel, I think the reason that people travel is because when you come back home is so much more sweet. All of the normal things just seem so wonderful. So I'm glad to be back. So.
And, traveling is it's so important. We won't get stuck on this long, but, I was in the Air Force for almost 7 years, and that enabled me to travel literally to 5 continents. And I think that once you travel the world and you get outside of your own paradigm, you get outside of your own ethnocentric type of ideas, it helps you really to be a better student, to be a better scholar, and in some ways to be a better human, because it opens your minds and allows you to know that there's different ways that things are done by different people in different places. And it gives you an opportunity to consider things that are outside your own dominant paradigm.
Yeah, I spent my early life in Japan. Then my first job was in South America, and I went to school in Europe for a while. So I had a chance really kind of to see the globe. Even as a young person, I was widely traveled. And my wife and I, we kind of gave our children the same experience. We traveled all over the place. My wife was a former flight attendant for Pan American.
Oh, I remember Pan Am.
Yeah, and so she is like a really irritating person to play Trivial Pursuit with, because in the geography section, she's been everywhere, and
Yeah.
Can't beat her. But yeah, travel is great. It's do it while you're young, because as you get older, it gets more difficult. Just the body has a harder time with long flights and things like that. So
I'll bet. Now, Joe, everybody gets fascinated by reading your book and thinking about Jesus being created, thinking about Jesus actually being something that was a literature creation. And it gets really hard for people to understand. And sometimes, we try to understand the big picture without learning the things that go into the picture. Not much of an analogy, but sometimes you can appreciate a painting more if you understand the strokes that are there and the skills that are about the painting and even the mixing and what the artist is thinking. And one thing that gets so missed, and I know now after reading the book so intensely, and it's really built on this idea of typology, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah, the Gospels are tip to stern typology. When the writer is writing a story about, seemingly a real-time experience of Jesus, he has another story in mind. It's the story of Jesus is based and linked to other stories. It's well known that typology is throughout the Gospels, the typology that relates Jesus's life to the Old Testament.
Joe, what would be a working man's definition of typology? As
just one story is based on another.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, and so and the other thing about typology is it's always fiction. Can never be historical. It's always based upon another story. So the story that's being presented is not being presented as a history. A question that comes up a lot is, is Jesus a historical character that was embellished or a fictional character that was, historic elements were added into. These are semantical problems that can never be resolved. The question that I think can be resolved is simply, what is the genre? Because, if you, if the author of Donald Duck had a duck that lived next door whose name was Donald, you could argue that he based the character on the name. You could say, well, then the cartoon character is historical. But the fact is, you're in a semantical world. You can never resolve the question. What you can resolve is, what is the intent? What is the genre the author is writing in? And the Gospels are not a history. They can be demonstrated, in my opinion, to be 100% typology. So there are no stories of Jesus that are grounded in historical fact. The author is not presenting a history. He is writing typology, which is a fictional genre. That's the key, is that the Gospels are a fictional genre. So the idea that you would look for a historical character inside them is basically a contradiction right off the bat, because it isn't a genre that is trying to produce history. It's trying to produce a particular kind of fiction.
Absolutely. And, just the people that are tuning in, maybe for the first time, I spent 20 years as a licensed full-time minister. I have a Bible college degree. And then after I left that church, I spent another 5 years in different independent churches. So I spent a quarter of my life so far. Well, maybe not quite, but getting close. I spent over a quarter of a century anyway, trying to prove that Jesus was real and believing that Jesus was real and that he was a historical figure. And if I can get to the place where I'm saying, after reading Joe's work and doing a lot of other study, that I now believe he's 100% right, I would challenge you to at least open your mind to it, at least consider it. And even if at the end of the day you decide that Joseph Atwill is wrong, I guarantee you that the journey would have broadened your mental horizons, expanded your paradigms, and you'll come out the other end of the journey a much more enlightened and educated person. So I would certainly encourage you to set aside disbelief and just listen for education's sake, if for nothing else. And Joe, you do a good job talking about typology in the book. And really the basic typology that the whole thing is based upon is some typology between Moses and Jesus, isn't it?
Yeah, the authors of the gospel always had in mind that at some point in the future, their typological message would be understood. I mean, you think about why would they put in the typology that I posit relates between Jesus and Titus. I mean, it's an enormously complicated literary achievement. I mean, it would cost a lot of money. You'd have all these different scribes involved. This was a huge deal. Why would they do it? They didn't need to do it in terms of creating a pacified Jewish Messiah that they could try to sell to militarized Jews as an alternative religion. They didn't need to put this typology in. The typology was put in for one reason, and that is vanity, legacy. So they want the character that Jesus predicts will come during the war, that Jesus refers to by a messianic title, the Son of Man. They want the posterity to understand who that individual was. They want us to know that they had become the Jewish Messiah, that Jesus was predicting them, that all of the events of his life are typologically related into the military campaign that they undertook to conquer Judea. So they have at the very beginning, the very first page. This is why, in fact, the Gospels have a kind of an order to them that hasn't really been understood. Once you understand the typology, you can see why Matthew is first and John is last, but you don't really understand that if you read it at kind of in the surface level. It just all seems chaotic. But the fact is, at the very beginning of the Gospel, very first page, you have a system of typology that links Jesus backwards in time to Moses. And if you don't mind, I'm just going to read. I'm going to go through the events very quickly. And the reason I'm doing this is, among other reasons, this simple little typological system that's made up of about 10 elements is the most important component in our literature. this simple little system, because this is the system that is not only basically the way that the Gospels are intended to be understood, but as if you read Shakespeare's Secret Messiah, you'll see that many other authors are aware of it and are using this system. And if you want to understand our literature, and in my opinion, our history, you've got to grasp this little system, because this will show you that the oligarchs have used typology throughout the last 2 millennium. And with it, they can talk among themselves. They can establish legacy. They can mock things that they want to make fun of. And they can do this in a way where the public doesn't understand.
So, Joe, in a sense, history, they say, is written by the winners. And in a sense, you're about to show us the language they use. Exactly.
This is the real language. And so anyway, at the beginning of Matthew, you've got this strange story. And in Matthew 2:12, Joseph goes to Egypt. Joseph has dreams, of course, it's well known. And 2:16, Matthew, Herod massacres the boys. At 2:20, you have a sentence which an angel appears and tells Joseph, "They are dead which sought the young child's life." Then you have the journey from Egypt back to Israel. You have the passing of through water. Jesus is baptized. Then he goes into the wilderness for 40 days. And you have the 3 temptations. And one, the sentence is he's tempted by bread. Then the next one, the devil is told, "Do not tempt God." And then finally, at 4:10, Matthew, the typological system concludes, and Jesus states, "Worship only God." Now, this is a typological system. These stories are not real in the sense of history. They are all lifted from the Old Testament, and they're easy to see once you understand the whole collection, because you'll see that they are in a sequence that enables the harder to see parallels to become visible. In the Old Testament, Genesis 45, Joseph goes to Egypt. He has the dreams. He decides he has to go there. But then in Exodus 1, you have the story where the Pharaoh massacres the boys, parallel to the Herod massacring the boys. Now in Exodus 4, you have a verbatim line. They lift the line in the New Testament right out of the Old Testament. "All the men are dead which sought thy life." Okay, so it's very verbatim. Then you have a return from Egypt to Israel. Okay, I'm going to go into that in a second. That's very important, because this is geography. The geographical sequence is always being maintained between Moses and Jesus. Now you have the passing through water, the baptism. This one is very hard to see, and because the Israelites going through the Red Sea, Jesus is baptized. But in Matthew, they actually lift verbatim sentences. Out of Egypt I called my son. Which is also a sentence from the story of Exodus, and so they make sure that an alert reader can verify that the two are parallel. Then you go into the wilderness, just as Jesus went into the wilderness. The Israelites go into the wilderness. Now here, the Israelites go in for 40 years. Jesus is 40 days. Typology is not verbatimism. They are giving you enough information that is parallel so you can see that one story is based upon the other, but they're never verbatim. It's never quite verbatim. There's always some slight differences. So it's 40 years, 40 days, 40 is the parallel. But then the temptations are lifted, the ones in Matthew are lifted directly from the story of Exodus. And the quotations, the tempted by bread, do not tempt God, worship only God. Those are verbatim quotes that are taken from the Old Testament, reused in Matthew. And so that is a typological system. Now it's built of locations. You start in Judea, you go to Egypt, return back to Judea. It has parallel concepts like the passing. And you have parallel names. You have Joseph is the same in both, and then you have some very verbatim stuff that is linked into. But the most important part is the sequence. The events that are used in the Old Testament that Matthew reuses are used in the same sequence in Matthew that they occurred in the Old Testament. So this little typologic system of parallel names, locations, and concepts occurring in the same order is then expanded forward, and it becomes basically the system that relates Jesus forward. The system related back to Moses. The New Testament is written in such a way that it will look forward to the events that occur in 40 years. All of Jesus's ministry is basically, kind of a recreation of Moses that is typologically linked into the Flavians' conquest, because they're creating the new covenant, the new Christianity, the new Judaism, which will have this Son of Man character as the centerpiece. And of course, that's the Caesar. That is, Caesar is just another title that he uses. So anyway, it's I always suggest to people to spend time with this. Just make sure you're familiar with it, so it kind of resonates. You can criticize it, see how it operates, because then when you go forward in Matthew, the very next passage, the one that after the conclusion of the Moses, is the event at the Sea of Galilee. And this is where you pick up the story going forward. And I have said that if you just took the fishing for men episode that Josephus describes, that Titus has at the Sea of Galilee, if you took that passage and put it in the Old Testament at the correct place in this sequence, and then concluded and then extended Matthew to have one more fishing for men, you would have no contestation. There wouldn't be one scholar in the world that would argue that wasn't part of the system. If Josephus's passage was in the Old Testament, which is at the same location, and you have the same concept of fishing for men that Jesus talks about, everyone, all scholars would say, yes, it is just an extension. It's one more element of this relationship back to Moses. But the fact is, it's not relating to Moses, it's relating forward. And so now, this is what the authors have done. They've given us enough information. We're supposed to have, like a primer, been educated in the typologic system in the simple version that is relating back to Moses, so that now when you come to the fishing for men at the Sea of Galilee, if you're familiar with Josephus's history of the Flavian campaign, you know that, well, the location is the same. The event is different. I mean, Jesus is maybe talking about evangelism, but in fact, Titus is literally fishing for men. But it's close enough conceptually that no one would miss that there is some parallelism. And so now it raises the question of, is the author of Matthew simply extending the typologic system into Josephus, right? It just is a natural question. And then when you get into the other parallels that I show in Caesar's Messiah, you can see that the answer is clearly yes, because you are backed up by the fact that many of the parallels are literally verbatim. I mean, in other words, like when Jesus says, I want to, he talks about the encircling of Jerusalem with the wall. Titus has the exact same event. You see, it's not a typologic relationship. It is the relationship that historians have always understood is the basis for Jesus' prediction. And so then when you go to the razing of the temple complex, or the abomination of desolation that is described in the New Testament, these are events which are historical and from Josephus's history, but they provide a very secure platform for the other parallels, because you see, once you have the fishing for men, the encircling of Jerusalem, the abomination of desolation, the leveling of the temple, you've already established dependency. Because you see, the sequence, it's not just the events. You could argue, well, these stories were in circulation. The author of the Gospels used them in the story of Jesus as a way of embellishing his life. But once you have a sequence of any length, you can say, no, wait a second. There is dependency. The Gospels, to some extent, are dependent upon the story of of the Flavian conquest of Judea. Well, at that point, in my opinion, you're right at the cusp of agreeing with Caesar's Messiah, because then when you start plugging all the other details in, then it's just very, very straightforward that, yeah, they deliberately constructed Jesus's ministry as a way to link it into the campaign, so that they're just in the same way that the Matthew typology shows that Jesus basically is like a new Moses, that he has this typologic religious relationship to the old Moses. Now, when you go forward, he is showing the same thing to the Son of Man character, who's coming with all the destruction in 40 years to raise the temple, et cetera, et cetera. So now you've answered the question. I mean, this was how they did it. The Caesars wanted a religion. They wanted legacy. They wanted a religion that would pacify the militarized version of Messianic Judaism, and they also wanted legacy. And this is how they did it. You see, they got this religion in place. They promoted it obviously with the imperial cult priests. They made it the state religion ultimately, so there wasn't any choice about it. But they always wanted the legacy. I mean, they knew eventually this was going to, be decoded, and when it did, then they would have their moment of glory. So what are the Gospels functionally? They're really, Jeff, they're just like the Arch of Titus. It's just in a literary form.
They are, and it's very interesting. And I consider myself a fairly decent scholar along biblical lines, but I learned something out of your book that absolutely rocked my world. And I wish I'd have learned it earlier, that the very word gospel you showed in Caesar's Messiah, where the very word gospel comes from.
Yeah. Its most common use is a declaration of good news of military victory, basically something that, you have to remember Rome is a kind of religious, militarized empire. Everything is religious. There's always, and so gospels was a term that applied to, kind of the good news of a Roman military victory that was, obviously God was promoting the empire according to the Caesars. But this is really kind of critical, because you can see that this is the sort of tongue-in-cheek meaning that they intended all along. That's why we have the term gospel, which now means, good news and things like this. But way back when, that was how the Caesars would have understood the expression, is that, and bear in mind, this really shouldn't be too hard to grasp, because these are military victories. When Jesus, of a particular Roman family, when Jesus talks about, the temple's going to be raised, Jerusalem's going to be encircled. I mean, these are military victories. So when you think of the term gospel, having a divine personage predicting these things, this is pretty close to just straightforward Roman propaganda. It's really not it's not very complicated. It's just straightforward Roman propaganda. God is ordaining that the Romans will defeat the Jews, and Jesus is predicting their military victories.
And it's a very strong literary, a very strong etymological argument, if I can use that word, that the word gospel was actually invented out of the imperial Roman emperor cult.
Yeah, there's a whole collection of words which are basically technical terms of the imperial cult. They were used in some other ways, but in general, in this era, they were terms that were often used in application to the divine Caesars. The imperial, and so those terms then show up in the Gospels in the New Testament. It's very suspicious, because, I mean, whoever the author is, he would have an understanding of these very, very particular, strange words, which he's using in a correct form, except he's using them about the character Jesus Christ and his experiences. But if you then, people can just Google technical terms of the imperial cult, and this will pop up. It's been like a mystery that people have wondered about. I mean, Caesar's Messiah just explains it, out of hand, that it's because this is the thought world. You've got scholars putting this thing together. They would have all been involved in, the literature of the imperial cult. And I think that, okay, so one thing that makes the gospel sort of hard to understand is people don't understand the imperial cult, what a powerful force it was, the scholars it had, the number of priests, and they also don't understand the war. They don't understand the Messianic war, just the details of the war. If you're really
even a tiny detail like the churches in Revelation were all places that had centers of the imperial cult,
exactly.
and Vespasian could have got mail to every one of them. It's when you see it, it's like, wow.
Yeah, that's right.
Please go back on track. I didn't.
Yeah, no, but that's just a great point. Is that what is historical? And then they name the cities and things. You can, if you are familiar with the imperial cult and with the history of the first century of the Roman Empire, a lot of this stuff just pops right into it. I think that one thing it just shocks me, just blows me away, is that the fishing for men parallel, which is so straightforward,
expand on that a little bit for our new viewers, Joe. What you mean by that?
Well, at the beginning of Titus's campaign, he comes to the Sea of Galilee. There's a lot of parallelism to what Jesus does with his apostles, but of course in the Gospels, Jesus comes to the Sea of Galilee and he gathers his first 3 disciples that he's going to have, and he says, "Follow me, and you'll become fishers of men." Now, in the history of the war, Titus has his first military battle where this is the first time he's been in charge of the army. He gathers his troops, says, "Don't be afraid." He then leads them against the Jewish rebels who are in boats on the Sea of Galilee. It's the same.
He personally leads the army, correct?
He leads the army, and then they sink the boats. The Jews attempt to swim to safety, of course, and they are caught like fish. They're speared and killed. And so there is a grim parallelism that is obvious, just obvious, because you have the location, you have the beginning of Titus's campaign. The location is obvious. Titus's campaign is a little esoteric, but the fact is, you are definitely fishing for men, and you're doing it literally. And so you would think that scholars would at least question the relationship. I mean, there are so many other things which the authors of the gospel are drawing from the war. I mean, the encircling of Jerusalem, the razing of the temple complex. These are military victories. So why has it not been the case that here's another military victory that has this obvious conceptual parallelism to what Jesus does, that would at least be considered? You see, you can see that it's basically just a vast mind control situation where the story in the Gospels was so iconic, became so concrete in our minds that even the scholarship couldn't really function normally, with normal human intelligence, because they were so weighed down by just the ideas in the Gospels that they couldn't see how just transparent the parallelism was. And I'll tell you,
absolutely transparent.
If they just had seen that, if someone had just brought this up, they'd go, "Gee, isn't it odd? There's fishing for men at the Sea of Galilee. It's strange." 100% would have.
But even the have no fear. You have no fear.
I know, that's right. All of the parallelism.
I'm leading you. It's Titus. Yeah. It's this. Oh,
well, and then remember, they should be looking. They should be looking for parallelism to the war, regardless of whether or not they want to go to a Flavian origin of the literature. They should be looking for parallelism to the war, because that is one of the very few historical facts we have about the Gospels. That there was events from the war that were used as concepts in the Gospels. So therefore, we should have looked at everything to see, well, what are the more potential conceptual relations? So the fishing for men thing, when a reader comes and sees there's Messiah to it, I would say that I don't go into this because it's too big of a subject, but I do think that a reader should spend a moment and just consider what it means for basically human consciousness that wasn't noticed. You see what I mean? This really shows there's some problem kind of conceptually because of the historical narratives that have been implanted inside of us. Because I'm telling you, brother, it's not very tough to see. It's funny, people are often I get praise for seeing it and for noticing the typology, and they don't understand, though, that actually, if you just get a tiny foothold into the system, it's very, very simple to see everything. It isn't hard at all. I'm always happy to receive praise, but I have to mention to people that, if you just hooked up one of the parallels and then just started to work, almost any person would do it. It's just, I don't know exactly why, but for some reason, I just wanted to try this approach, and there it is. But anyone can do it. It's not hard to understand. It's not a big, it's complicated, but it isn't like, you don't have to like mind puzzle through these things. There are some of the parallels that are impossible to see except for in sequence. A lot of them are very, very straightforward. Jesus says, cut down the fruit trees. At the same location, Titus cuts down the fruit trees. That's not a hard thing to see. Hadn't been noticed before, but once you get the sequence right. But there are concepts. My favorite one would be the Good Samaritan.
Oh, this is just so good. Please.
I just love the Good Samaritan because Titus, he has this legion with him, and they mention how well refurbished they are, and then Titus spends a night in the lodge. Well, if you're reading along in the Gospels, you have the story of the Good Samaritan, and how the Samaritan is they rob from him, and then the Good Samaritan, right? Well, Titus has just come from Samaria, so this is where he comes from.
He just came from Samaria.
Just comes from Samaria. That's how the story begins, and then they talk about the legion. Now, this legion you have to know, because it isn't on the text. You have to know that this was the legion that was defeated by the Jewish zealots to start the war, and that they stole all of their provisions. The
Sicarii, right?
Yeah, the Sicarii stole all of the provisions. And so now the story of the Good Samaritan starts to clear up a little bit. You can see kind of the broad strokes. You can see, well, wait a second, it kind of typologically is relating, isn't it, to how the legion was restored from what was stolen from it. Josephus refers to them by the fancy Greek word for thief. The Gospels also says, lestates. The thief stole from this individual, and then the Good Samaritan comes and restores stuff, right? So now, in isolation, you would be not often agreed with about these, one is based on the other. They would go, well, it's parallel mania. However, within the sequence, it becomes really clear cut. And so that this mystery, because the story of the Good Samaritan, it kind of doesn't make much sense. it sort of makes sense. He's being nice to someone who got robbed, but what exactly is the basis for the story? If it isn't this character Jesus Christ, where did it come from? Well, once you get the sequence of events linked up between the war and the Gospels, well, now these things really make sense. And I'll tell you, just on a literary perspective, the wit of the authors becomes visible, because the story of the Good Samaritan is actually beautifully constructed in literature, very interesting symbolism, but you cannot understand it if you don't have the basis for it. Another story is the three crucified, one survives.
Here we go, yeah.
Now, I was the first person to ever copyright the parallelism. There was a guy named Cliff Carrington in Australia who saw the parallelism, and he was just a fantastic scholar and reader, just an amazing autodidact. He just read everything. And Cliff saw the parallelism, and when Caesar's Messiah came out, he contacted me, and we exchanged notes, and it was amazing. He was someone who who just through the power of his reading was getting these parallelisms. Whereas, and I told him, I said, Cliff, I got the parallel of the three crucified, one survived because I knew where to look. You see, once I had the fact that there was a sequence and that it was and I just had to find that point in time in Josephus's works that he was between when the temple was destroyed and when John and Simon were going to be given their fate. There was a period, this is where the crucifixion. So I just had to go and look. It's only a couple hundred words of text. And there I found the story of not Joseph of Arimathea, but Joseph Barmathea, two different Greek letters, right? But it's not verbatimism, but it's typology. So he sees a group of three, just like in the Gospels. He takes them down. One of them survives. He has to beg the Roman commander, of course, to do this. But so it's you go, wait a second. There's just too many parallelism here. The Joseph Barmathea, Joseph Arimathea. A guy surviving a crucifixion, the group of three, the Roman commander. These stories are very much related. No one had ever seen it. I mean, literally, it's like the fishing friend. I was just astounded. When I did my analysis, I put the analysis, I was so concerned about causing, negative results and psychological problems for Christians. I just didn't know what to do with it. I left the analysis for almost 3 years. I just put it in a box and I just let it sit there. I brought it out like 2000. I did the analysis like in the mid 90s. I brought it out as a self-published book, just a pamphlet. And I thought that other scholars would just pick it up and I would be done with it. I would not be involved with it because there would be scholarship would come in. Some scholars strongly supported it. Robert Eisenman wrote James, Brother of Jesus. He got his hands on it. He's the one who really, kind of said I needed to go to another level, and he introduced me to publishers, and then Ulysses picked it up and became published. But the fact is that I expected, because I'm not an academic, I hadn't been trained in all of the background. I expected that a lot of the parallels would already been noticed. But that's when I realized, well, wait a second, there's some kind of like vast intellectual flaw. and because no one had even bothered to look at the fishing for men parallel. No one had ever done, I mean, this is how sad this is. In England, they have legends about the guy who took Jesus down from the cross.
Was this Longinus? Is that his name?
Yeah, well, no. Well, Longinus speared him.
Longinus speared him.
They have actually in Glastonbury, they actually have this whole kind of mythology about Joseph of Arimathea, but he isn't called Joseph of Arimathea. They call him Joseph Bar Matthias.
Boom.
They use the exact name of the author of the Wars of the Jews. They somehow they didn't have the right memo given to them, or a different version. Maybe they changed it later on, but whatever. That's how they refer to him. So the thing is, if you then use that as one of the ways, a derivation of Josephus's name, good heavens, the story where he takes him down from the cross and someone survives, where is the sort of kind of intellectual activity of scholarship? They should have been looking at this stuff. It shouldn't have been a non-academic, kind of enthusiast who went through it and made these relationships. That we are really dealing with the results of a bad historical narrative, and there's a very important lesson there for us, about our minds. That historical narratives, they basically change the nature of our thinking. You see, and that's, to me, it's one good thing about Caesar's Messiah, hopefully, is that it'll get people to be aware, wait a second, we've got to be more skeptical, we've got to keep an open mind, we can't just, once the historical narrative is given to us, there are consequences to that. So we have to be very, very careful of what we believe, what we accept as history.
Absolutely. And I'm just sitting here thinking, I jotted down just a couple little notes. Things that are the very basis, the very foundation of Christianity and of the Judeo-Christian West. This idea of the gospel, it is actually a Roman imperial word. This idea of fishing for men and making converts and bringing people into this quote unquote truth is actually about killing people. And you get into the idea of the gospel is really nothing but propaganda. And Joe, how good the propaganda has been. I'm wondering, I'm thinking about Josephus, I'm thinking about, Alexander, I'm thinking about the people that wrote it. Did they know? Would they be surprised how long it took us to see it?
No, I don't think so. I think
Really?
that when they created the state religion, they were pretty sure they could dominate the collected intellect. I mean, they studied the Gospels and Christianity are very sophisticated propaganda. They must have been analyzing the mind of their subjects for control, how to do it, and I think that it's not just the literature; it's the power of basically of the authority. Once they made it the state religion, and over time they were able to, well, of course, remember, they also onset the Dark Ages. You see, in my opinion, when they onset Christianity, if you look at where Rome was in the first century, it was on the cusp of the Industrial Revolution. It had everything. I mean, all it needed was the piston, and they would have been there. They had every single aspect, all the math. Yeah, they're right on it. But the oligarchs knew that is unknown territory. If you start developing that kind of broad technology, how could they be sure of maintaining slavery on a mass scale? Probably not. So they said, well, wait a second, let's replace that with Christianity. So that's really what Christianity was for the European mind. It was a way to maintain us in an infantile and easily to control strength, of intellectual strength, so the oligarchs could maintain power. I mean, I think that that's why I think they definitely saw this as 1,000 years or more of their power.
Interesting
Sure,
number
they had,
that.
some kind of power. I mean, you think about just like how they set up the Vatican. I mean, the Pontiff Maximus, that is the name that the Caesar was given as head of the Roman College of Priests. So you can see that it isn't just, it's not just kind of derived. It's literally the same thing. And then bear in mind that, like St. Peter's, the huge square where they have the obelisk in the center. I mean, that was the Flavian circus. That was exactly where they had their circle. Where the obelisk is now would have been surrounded by chariots that the Flavians would have been sitting there watching. And
I did not know that, Joe.
Yeah,
that is absolutely.
Yeah, and bear in mind that the circus that they would have been. This would have been actually built by Nero, but it would have been the Flavian circus when they were writing the Gospels. Bear in mind, the circus is a religious structure. It isn't just to entertain the public. It's everything had been, made divine. The Colosseum, these things where the games were, these were all temples, basically.
Really?
So, yeah. Oh, yeah. And so the circus would have been an area where there would have been religious ritual. They would have. They actually. This is how bad it is. This stuff is just grim. But the Circus Maximus was actually a headquarter of the imperial cult. The Circus Maximus. So
it still is.
And it's still. I'm glad you said it, not me. But so see, actually, I get criticized sometimes. I don't use the term circus. I talk because of the mockery aspect of it. The term circus. If you say this is a circus, right. So I don't use that term when I talk about basically the Vatican. I just say it was like an imperial palace.
Gotcha.
But what it was is an imperial circus that they actually then just made into. It's just a very sad thing because you can just stand back from this and see that there should have been some more focus into the relationship between Christianity and the Roman imperial cult, because what we have today has so many elements of it, and the Gospels have so many reflections of military victories that would have been, I mean, if you go to the Arch of Titus, it's in existence. You can see that there they talk about the god Vespasian and the son of God Titus.
Yes.
It's written in stone. And you can see events that Jesus is predicting, the destruction of the temple, the war. They're carved in stone, you see. The Arch of Titus with the God and the Son of God, I mean, how can a clear-minded person not look at those things and not see some parallelism? It just seems to me that with an open mind, with a clear mind, you look at that and you would go, we'd better look at the Gospels with the idea of where is the influence coming from? God, the Son of God. I mean, this looks like it's all flowing from basically the Caesars, the Flavian court. So it's a sad story, but it's one that has to be understood, because I just think without understanding it, we're not going to really have a clear mind about ourselves, So,
Joe, just let me reconfirm something, make sure
Sure.
I heard you right. You're saying that the St. Peter's Basilica, I think they call it, that big circle out there that's got the obelisk in the middle, that is actually the site of where Nero's Circus Maximus would have been.
Well, that's exactly right. And in fact,
holy crap.
And this is, and there are architectural sketches of it. I mean, it was long since, replaced, right. but that it actually had the obelisk in the center, and it was the same courtyard. And so it's a sad.
That's not in the book.
No, it's because of the term circus.
Yeah.
I don't want people. It's hard. You can imagine. I don't want people to think I'm mocking their faith. I don't want people to think I'm mocking, their understanding. So I just try to keep the language as neutral as I can and let the reader see, fill in like whatever emotion there is, of the passion and stuff. And I always thought that that's a great thing to bring up to people, but it's just too dark, because the circus, of course, would be where, they'd be slaughtering people. I mean, if you get into what the Roman and these circuses were, but the fact is, the Circus Maximus, which is a different circus, there was more than one. The circus that the Vatican is built on is Nero's, which then the Flavians took over when they deposed the Julio Claudius. They then, it became their circus, and it was literally Domitian's. I mean, he may have been actually living in the buildings because he was there so often.
Joe?
And this was their, it was where they would have religious ceremonies and things. And then, of course, going forward, it becomes the Vatican.
Joe, who would you say would be living in those buildings? You said he. I missed you there.
Well, Domitian, okay. because there's so many attributions of his being there.
Right.
I mean, he really. In fact, if you read Shakespeare's Secret Messiah, you'll see there I get a little bolder when I talk about, if you get to the part about Domitian, I talk about Domitian's making fun of John, who has a vision that begins the book of Revelation, and he talks about basically, colors going around in a circle. What he's actually making fun of, I show the typology, he's making fun of the chariot races that Domitian held. Now, these races with the different colored chariots, which are being lampooned in the book of Revelation.
With the horsemen?
With the horsemen, yeah. This is taking place.
I can see I'm going to be up late tonight, Joe. I got to get into this.
I mean, this is taking place in the courtyard of St. Peter's.
Oh,
I mean, this is the track that is actually.
This is mind blowing. Mind blowing.
It is a lump. But anyway, so So that's the once you get the correct kind of sort of orientation to the literature, which you get, by going forward with the very simple typology, going back to Moses, and then getting the typology. It gets more complicated, but you can, because of the sequence, you can see things like the Samaritan, what it all means. And then when you get to more complex stuff like the Book of Revelation, it isn't that hard. You can now say, wait a second, I can kind of see what this literature is made up of. And then then you get to actually see some of the real history. This is the funny thing is like the dates of the first century, obviously fake. You can see that because Jesus's crucifixion is 40 years to the day to the end of the Jewish-Roman War, 40 years. And now this is obviously, fake because the human Passover lamb, the new covenant of the new, the sacrifice of the new covenant couldn't have this perfect 40-year relationship, which mirrors the 40 years of the old covenant, right? From the Passover to the enter into the promised land. Anyway, so that means, unfortunately, that the dates are fake. So we don't really have a good history. We just have these religious dates, the year 1, the year 30, the year 33, and just to digress, another example is, you have the abomination of desolation.
Yes.
Josephus says, oh my God, you've got end of the daily sacrifice. He goes, the prophet saw it. He's talking about Daniel. He goes, he saw it. Amazing. Well, that would be the midway point of a week, because remember, so now you go out 3.5 years, and now you have the conclusion of the war, which would be Masada. And then, of course, the beginning of the war is when the Flavians land on the beach, right? So they have the 7 years that is being, they're mocking Daniel. But obviously, that means that the term of the war is fake. You can't do that. You don't have religious beginning and ends, right, to mirror Daniel. They're just making this stuff up after the fact to basically to create a mirror between the new covenant and the old covenant.
But not to mention, the best way to make your prophecy come true is to write it after it's already happened.
Always easier.
Backdate it.
Yeah. But you see, the problem is that it wrecks the first century. The dates are no good. So we don't really know any. So the history is really hard to see. They don't tell us stuff. We get propaganda. The dates are fake. The events probably are fake. So I always say, well, you want to know the history. The best way is basically to try to get an understanding of the system of typology, because there at least you can see the real sarcasm, the real viciousness, the real events that they're relating to. Everything else is kind of a fairy tale. When Jesus talks about the fishing for men, and you go, well, actually, this is a joke that the imperial class shared about how they fished for men at the Sea of Galilee. The viciousness is the real history. The fairy tale is not. So it's again, it's with the idea that the citizen needs to have this information, because without it, how do we have enough skepticism and the alertness, the wariness, to make sure we don't let our understanding of history that is being given to us have the effect of propaganda and wreck our thinking.
Absolutely. We've been talking to the author of Caesar's Messiah. That's his first book. And I got the Flavian Conspiracy to Invent Jesus. There's a Flavian signature edition. I recommend that you get that one. It's got some extra information in it.
That is the Flavian signature. That one has that's the book that they should get. There's a couple of versions of it, but that one has the more current analysis.
Make sure you get down here at the bottom. It says Flavian signature edition.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Make sure you get that one. And the other book that I'll be up all night reading is Shakespeare's Secret Messiah, also by Joseph Atwill. That's the ones that we've been talking about. And let me make a strong statement, and this is not Joseph's statement, this is my statement. If you read these two books, ladies and gentlemen, it'd be much better for you than reading the Bible. I'm just going to put it out there.
Yeah, probably true. If you're going to read the Bible, you should at least read Caesar's Messiah so that you have some way to keep yourself mentally balanced, because the Bible is so cleverly written that it's very easy to fall into faith, to fall into love of Jesus in such a way that you can't think.
And Joe, if someone really does believe the Bible story, they really believe that Jesus is their Messiah, they believe it's all true, they believe it's the foundation of civilization. If they're that convinced in it, what would it hurt to go ahead and read Caesar's Messiah just to give yourself a validation of what you believe is true, just to read the best investigation of your faith? Even if you're a Bible believing Christian, read Caesar's Messiah. It's got to help you, even if you come out the other end still believing in the Bible.
I think it's a useful thing just for the perspective of having good thinking skills. I mean, that's kind of what it's written for. I mean, they wrote this typology not for hoi polloi, but for people who are clever thinkers. That's who they want their legacy from. And so
we're not clever thinkers anymore, Joe. I think reading your book will help.
I think it does. That's my opinion. The sales of the book have just been astounding. There's no promotion. I don't promote the book. I mean, I come on shows. I'm happy to talk about it, but there is no advertising of the book. It's all done by word of mouth, and I think that's a very good way for people to be introduced to it, because it's coming from someone who's read the book and has a sense about it. I am and hopeful that it's good for democracy. Because to me, democracy needs really a lot of citizens who are good thinkers, and that's kind of what Christianity was, in my opinion, created to prevent. And so I hope we can, with your show and my book, we can clean this up, because we really don't want the oligarchs to control us. It's just not good.
Joe, do you happen to know Joe Rogan?
I do not know. No.
If Joe invited you on his show, would you go on?
Of course, yeah.
I'm going to make that my personal mission. I know a guy who's good friends with Joe Rogan. I'm going to contact him. I'm going to tell him that I've talked with you, and I'm going to do everything I can to get Joe to extend to you an invitation. I think that would literally change the world if you could be on that show.
It's a good time to do larger kind of venues, because there's just enough people now who've read the book. I think that if there was, kind of a press conference about this information, there would be enough people that could help other people sort of understand it and go through the process, because it's pretty traumatic.
Oh, yeah.
And so, but this is a good time. What can I say? I think that there are just times in history, periods where things change. And I think that this is one of them. And I think that the book is a useful thing for that perspective, that we need to change on a large scale. I'll tell you the truth. Here's what I don't want to beat around the bush. I just think that you look at Caesar's Messiah and you go, gosh, these oligarchs, they have so many clever ways to control us. They love power. They want to ossify it. They want to keep it through generations. How do we defend ourselves? Well, the problem is that they are now developing technologic skills.
Yes.
In the old days, it was just us against them, and literature was basically all that they had, their only tool, and of course the military. Well, but now they are getting so many skills and the citizen needs to become more powerful in terms of democracy. You need to have more wariness, more ability to fight back. I mean, you look at things, how they can control information, with Facebook and Google and in just the movies. There's just so many ways they can get our mind now so effectively. I really hope that the citizen his game can get better as well, that we can get a little more skeptical, a little better thinking to fight to keep our freedom, so that the technical skills that the oligarchs develop can be met by a higher level of citizenry and more effective democracy, because we just think better.
Absolutely. Joe, those are great words. I thank you again for writing these 2 books, and hopefully we can get them out to an even wider audience. Thanks so much for spending your time with us. And I hope that
Jeff, it's like, I just, I think before with the show, I was talking, just your show is so great. It's like literally, it's my favorite show to watch. The only time I don't watch it is when I'm on, because I always get kind of self-conscious. I always think, gosh, if only I thought of this or that, but I love your analysis, and I hope that your show becomes really, really widespread, because this would be another way that the quality of our democracy gets better. You know what I mean?
Joe, let me ask you a question then. I was going to ask you this off the air, but let me just be very open and ask you this question. You are such a gentleman. You go out of your way not to be controversial. You go out of your way not to stir people up. I'm on the exact opposite end of that paradigm. I stir it up. I fire it up. I get people. And people have said to me, Jeff, even your name, the Christian Whistleblower, half the people that need to listen to you won't, just because of the name. Do you think I should tone it down?
No, I think you should ratchet it up. I unfortunately, when you look at the effects of the propaganda, the real trademark is mental numbness, and I just don't know how calm thought can get in. You see what I mean? Yeah. I take the attitude of trying to be polite, because the book is basically doing the hard work for me. What I'm trying to do is just get people to read it, and then they come to their own conclusion. So I don't, but for a show like yours, which is so much broader, I think you should have the confidence and arrogance, basically, of like how of the fact that you're really trying to address a very desperate situation.
What, Joe? We almost have to take, the old expression, fight fire with fire. We almost have to come with that same arrogance and wit and nastiness of the Romans and meet them with it.
Exactly right. I mean, if you look at the oligarchs' mouthpieces on the television, they're so well spoken. They intimidate. They have the browbeat, and they don't let anyone question different ideas. We need to create role models, and that's how I look to you as a role model. Honestly, I look to your attitude, your clear-mindedness, and just your power. Of you don't get pushed around. That's really important. We are, one of the things that they've made us is timid. I mean, that is 100% fact, is that they have made us timid, and that they didn't do that because they wanted to create a nice society. This isn't a workers' paradise. This is a slave state. They want timid slaves. And so, no, I like it when you when you go off. So please, I just think you can trust yourself. You have really good instincts. Trust them. Just be what you need to be to get the information across, and don't let anyone, and not just you, because you don't. This isn't a problem you have, but so many people don't let them push you around. It's just, that's how they do it. They intimidate. Gotta fight.
We're gonna have to end this show before I start weeping. Those words mean so much to me. I really appreciate it so much.
It's my pleasure, and I hope I can come back on again. I thought that was good, really fun for me to, and not just fun, but it was really good information for people. I hope I can come back again, Joe.
What might be a fun one, Joe, is to have us both in the same room doing a show.
Yeah, absolutely. Where are you? Where do you live?
I'm in Kansas. I would love to come out and meet you, and we can do some talking.
It's an open invitation. I'm not sure how the technology would work with my little iMac, but I think it'd be great to do shows. It would be wonderful. So let's try to make that happen in the near future. Okay.
We will, Joe. We'll make it happen. I appreciate it.
All right, brother. Good
Joe,
talk.
I've never met you, but I feel like you're a dear friend of mine. I wish you all health.
Yeah, me too. I feel the same way. It's funny how the internet has created this. It's like a new human experience where like some of my closest friends now are people I've never actually physically met, because the internet, you can get related to people of kind of like similar mindsets,
Right.
and they're not that, it's hard to find them out there in the real world, or the world, you know what I mean? It's like, but somehow the internet, we can meet one another and become close. And that's important, because brotherhood is 100% necessary.
Yes.
Brotherhood is something, and sisterhood, I'm not talking in a sexist way. I'm saying that we do not protect one another. We don't relate to each other like we should. That's all. We've been atomized, isolated, individualized. So I love the idea of trying to promote, restoration of that intense closeness, that sense of intimacy, that these are people I'll defend,
Absolutely.
All right, brother.
He's Joseph Atwill.
Thank you.
I'm Jeffrey Daugherty, and there's nothing really other to say than there's never been a better time than today to begin, ladies and gentlemen, to unindoctrinate yourself. Joe, we'll see you again real soon. It's been an honor and a privilege, and we will make that happen.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Take care now.